Hi, I'm Irina Falcone, WTA Tour player, and you're listening to Compete Like a Champion.
Welcome to Compete Like a Champion. You're here with Dr. Lauer, mental skills specialist, and Coach Johnny Park with USTA Player Development. Today, we've got the second part to our interview with Dr. Peter Scales, who is a U.S. Professional Tennis Association certified teaching pro, an internationally known scholar in positive youth development, and author to the book Mental and Emotional Training for Tennis, Compete, Learn, Honor. Dr. Scales, thanks for coming back and joining us.
Glad to be here, Johnny. Look forward to the second part of our conversation.
Brilliant. So, you know, we at the end of the first part, we were starting to get into the Compete, Learn, Honor framework, and you took us through the honor and a little bit of the learn part in some detail. I was wondering if you can, before kind of diving into that a little bit more, and especially the compete part, if you can frame your philosophy a little bit for us first, and then we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Compete, learn, and honor, real simple. If we give 100% effort at all times, if we're open, curious, and humble learners, and if by how we behave and act, we bring credit to ourselves, teammates, opponents, officials, coaches, family, school, and the game of tennis, then guess what? We're winners regardless of our WL record. So that's the foundational philosophy. That doesn't mean we don't want to win. We're training to win. We're competing to win. We want to win. But the winning is a byproduct, and that's not the goal. The goal is improvement as a player and as a person. So that's the nutshell explanation.
That makes a lot of sense, Peter. And again, I think you and I share a similar philosophy, and that's why I enjoyed your book a lot, because it made me feel like I knew what I was talking about on some level. No, but honestly, you know, this idea of focusing on the process, right, of the way you do things, on learning and how you treat others, and bringing it to that, how does that impact the player's anxiety? And I think we may have touched this on the first part of this series, but I wanted to go back through it again. If someone's focused on competing, learning, and honoring, what does that mean for things like anxiety and fear, and how does that impact those things?
Right. Well, you know, we talked last time a little bit about where fear comes from, and generally we call it the ABCs. It's some sort of loss of autonomy or control, feeling threats to belonging and relationships, and C, competence, feeling like, gee, you know, I'm going to look like a complete idiot out there if I keep playing like this. So the fears, the anxieties surround those ABCs. And what I'm trying to tell players is, look, all of those emotions are normal. They're natural. We're not trying to get you not to have those feelings, because those feelings of nerves and stress and fear, that means you care about the moment you're in. You care about this. That's a good thing. And a little bit of that can be energizing, as we know, physiologically and psychologically. We don't want it to get to be paralyzing. We want it to be energizing. And so I think all of what I do with Compete, Learn, Honor is to help players change their perspective from seeing threats to seeing challenges, and then even further to seeing opportunities. So it's not denying what's there. I don't want to pretend that we're not going to judge ourselves. We're not going to have emotions. We're going to have these feelings. Accept them, name them, release them, learn how to work with them, and move on. So it doesn't replace the anxiety. It massages the anxiety and allows quicker recovery and more creative ways of, I guess, for lack of a better word, judoing the situations. I was a judo player in high school, so I wasn't a big guy, and I'm still not a big guy. So I'm always looking for how can I use my opponent's strengths or the things that are happening, quote, to me, to my advantage. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do is get a reframing going that this threat is a challenge and eventually even an opportunity.
Yeah, that's a definitely an interesting way to put it, and it sounds a lot like this positive psychology approach that you hear a lot now these days, which was going on in sports psychology for 40 years, but that's another story. But it's interesting because if you're able to normalize it, you're able to accept it, you're much easier able to let things go, right? And then you can open your mind to the possibilities, right? The problem solve, to actually pay attention to what's going on the other side of the court and what's happening with your opponent. Have you seen that in the players that you work with, that, when you've helped them to focus more on the process of learning and getting better, honoring the game, honoring themselves, honoring others, and just competing, you find that this is opening up their mind as well to what's happening and freeing them to play the game and enjoy it more the way you were able to personally?
Yeah, I mean, it happens, but as you know, it happens over a period of time, and it happens with progressions, just like, stroke production. We work through progressions, and it's not going to be a snap of a finger. So how I like to illustrate it is that we want to get a player going from negative to positive, but they have to go through neutral first. The same way that in our stroke production and our movement, if we're pulled out really wide, totally on defense, we're probably not going to be smart to go for a winner. From that position, we're trying to get it up high and deep down the middle, get back in the point, get it to neutral. Then we can think about positive. So it's this progression from get the negative to neutral, and then the neutral can become a positive. Cheating, for example, is, people making bad line calls is a problem that everybody faces. And so, the first reaction is, perhaps anger. And so we're not going to get from anger to acceptance of that opponent as a positive human being, a child of God in a split second. We've got to go to neutral. So what I'm teaching them is, in that kind of a situation, you may have to lose a few points the same way that in doubles, you might get burned a few times down the alley because you're doing the work you have to do to protect the middle. So you accept those. You don't start going over to protect the alley, because now your whole plan is shot. So if you react, if you allow yourself to make that reaction and continue the anger and not accept that, then that takes over your game. So acceptance, and then once they've understood that they can choose to accept these moments of adversity, then we can talk to them about, and you know what? If somebody's cheating on the line calls, guess what that tells you? They're afraid they can't beat you playing straight up. They have fear. So that should give you confidence. So that's the positive, but it takes a while to get from the negative to the positive. So I want to get to neutral first. And that's a lot of what we do with wording. I worked with a player recently, and I had them take the time to record in practice, in all their practice matches for a week, record what your reaction is after every point. And so with the cooperation of the practice partner, they did, and they made 150 voice recordings over the course of the week. And we saw patterns, right? And part of the pattern was that there was this immediate negative reaction of this player saying, that's bad, that's good, that making these judgments that were very final and very personal. And so our first step was, let's try and figure out what language you could use that's a little more neutral. And we settled on, instead of bad, ineffective or didn't work. Instead of good, effective, worked. Do that again. So, yeah.
And That's a great comment you just made there about recording our reactions. And it brings me, the first thought that came to mind took me back to when I was in high school, and my tennis coach actually did it with us. More so in particular, there was one player that would just do some ridiculous things after. He'd get highly emotional, lose a point. One time, he threw his racket on the floor, got up in a press-up position, and went and just started headbutting his racket in a press-up position on the floor. And it just got me thinking about that a little bit, because then that sprouted on my coach starting to record our reactions and having us watch those back to basically say, are these helpful or are these not helpful? If they're not helpful, we need to change it. And then also brings me forward to some of the work that Dr. Bob Neff does with his charting reactions, whether there was a positive reaction or a negative reaction, and being able to take the athletes through their charts on negative and positive reactions according to how the flow of the match goes, which is a great look and a great spin of how you view your matches, which we don't always get into the details of. When we talk about our emotions, we generally talk about it from a general perspective. Well, in this match overall, you were pretty good. There were moments you were highly, reactive and emotional. There were times where you pulled it together, but we don't actually look at it into the details of how it affects you from point to point. And I think it's an absolutely fun, and it's something that I think both coaches and parents can do when watching their kids play or watching any players play. It's something that they can do, is chart that. So that was a brilliant point you brought up there. I don't know if Larry, you wanted to elaborate on that, because obviously Dr. Bob Neff is part of your mental performance team and something that he's brought to the table a little bit more.
Yeah, no, we definitely think that's a great technique, and it's something that our whole team uses, and we do it in different ways. We may look at reactions. We may be charting their routines and how consistent they are, time between points, what happens during the point, and then what's happening with their reactions or what they're doing between points. So there's a number of ways, but I think if you kick it back to Peter, I think what we're talking about here, going off of your comment about recording the reactions, what you're talking about is creating awareness.
Exactly.
Awareness. And once you have awareness, then you can begin to understand and accept.
That's exactly right. And there's a bit of a paradox here, because in the book, one of the things I talk about is the importance of losing the self, because humility allows you to learn. But the paradox is that before you can lose the self, you have to really understand yourself. And so we do a lot of assessing of strengths and areas for development throughout the whole, range of important tennis skills, not just the mental and emotional, and then using that to build goals and plans. But it's exactly that, learning about what your patterns are. We all have patterns. And that goes hand in hand with helping the players understand that they're making choices every second, off the court, on the court. They're making choices. Things aren't happening to them. They are choosing how to react in each of these situations. And I think a lot of players really they honestly don't understand what their patterns are. They don't know. And so that very first step of, we've got to record this. You have to see it. And I think it's really helpful for them to be doing it themselves and the self-discovery of it, because of course then they own it more. So, we're guiding the self-discovery, but it's better than me saying, I watched you and you did this and this and this. That's why I want them to chart it themselves. And then we can talk about, well, what patterns did you see in yourself? And there's these light bulbs going off of, wow, I didn't realize I did that. And yeah, I do. So.
Yeah, and that's some of the best work we can do is on court. And then I think about, if you get that awareness and you find acceptance, then we were talking about earlier what you control, right? And you don't control necessarily what's happening in the past or what's happening in the environment. You control your response to it. And typically what I've found is when a player takes responsibility for what they control and accept the things that they don't control, now you really start to take off. Now you can move from neutral to positive, I think.
Right. And we do something that really tries to drive that home, that winners are not people who win the most sets or games or points. Winners are people who take responsibility for what they do. That's the bottom line. And so one year I was so tired of the excuses that my guys were making on our boys team, that I made up this box called the excuse box. I wrote excuse box on it, and I put it out on the court right inside the gate. And it's like, when you come out on the court, drop your excuses into that box, because this has to be an excuse-free zone, a mistake-friendly zone, free zone. And I had one guy look at that and he said, "Coach, I got more excuses than are going to fit in that little box." And so I got a bigger one. And then subsequent years, the girls team decided that my handwriting was ugly. The box had gotten shabby. They made me a nice box. So now we have 2 excuse boxes, for very average size excuses and then super size excuses. And sometimes they just sit in the box, right? So it's a kind of a teenage excuse sauna, and they come out of that box feeling like, okay, I'm cleansed. No more excuses. And it really gets the point home, because as soon as we introduce that excuse box, then when people start saying, "Oh, I messed that up because the sun was in my eyes." Excuse box. I mean, you can hear it, people yelling it around the courts. So they own it. And it's just a little thing, but it really drives home the point that you make choices and you're responsible for the choices you make. And that means you can make different choices. You're not stuck. Get out of the excuse box. Play.
Like the excuse box. We need one for this podcast, Johnny.
It would be filled with all of your Post-it notes, Larry.
I don't know what you're talking
design
about.
one.
Yeah, I don't want that shabby one. I want that pretty well done one.
Yeah. Amy, do you think? I think we need to work on getting an excuse box. Maybe when we're back into normal civilization, we could put it on the table in the studio.
Maybe that can be Issa's crafting project this week.
Perfect. I'll get her on it.
I thought Mick's podcasting chateau was the excuse box, the whole room.
Sorry, Mick. We love you.
We still love you, man.
So, Larry, this is absolutely great, and we're touching on a lot of things, especially like routines and creating habits, and obviously, a lot of what we've talked about within Compete, Learn, and Honor is about framing habits that last for the long term. But what I found particularly interesting was you said, obviously, all these principles are important for athletes to develop into habits, but 2 especially are non-negotiable. So I wanted to have you take us through those 2 non-negotiables that you talk about, when you're working with your players or when you're speaking to people around around the country.
Yeah, the 2, I think they're all important that are in the book, but the 2 that I think are the foundational ones are loving the game more than how you perform, and losing yourself, your focus on yourself. Humility allows you to learn, and they're obviously correlated. They're connected. The loving the game more than how you perform is a real challenge for most people, because we live in a culture that prizes achievement, winning, and we're not really spending a lot of time talking about process. And coaches are under a lot of pressure to win. So it's parents, players, coaches, the media, all of it is focused on winning. So it's not easy for a coach to counterweight that, whether it's with a coach who's a pro at a club or a coach on a high school or college team. It's hard to do. But here's the thing. If we can get those players to understand that the game was here long before you. The game will be here long after you. The game doesn't owe you anything, okay? It's bigger than you are. That actually takes pressure off you. It takes pressure off you if you're playing for the love of playing, which is why, you know, one of the great exercises, and I think, Larry, this is in your book, and I use this a lot too, is having players write down what they love about playing tennis, what they love about being a tennis player, because we lose sight of that. And the higher up the ladder we go, the more pressurized, the more winning becomes, you know, so obviously important. The greater the distance sometimes, or oftentimes, between that kind of mindset and the total heart feeling we had for our sport when we first fell in love with it. So a lot of this is trying to recapture those feelings and say, you know what, that's why you're playing. That's why you're playing. If you're only enjoying yourself and having fun out there when you win, then you're guaranteed to be having a terrible time a lot of the time out on the court. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I lose a lot, you know? And so you're either gonna, it's a choice. You're either gonna learn to learn something about those losses and, you know, enjoy that aspect of it, or not. So it's really, really important to do that for both competitive reasons and for mental health reasons. And losing the self in the same way. If you're focused on yourself and performance, again, you're not focused on flow. You're not focused on seeing what you're doing to your opponent and how the pieces are moving. If you're focused on winning and losing, okay, that part of the self, you know, that old Yogi Berra quote, you can observe a lot by watching. Well, yes, you can, in his head scratching way. You can observe a lot by watching, but not if you're focused on yourself, because that's all you're going to see. You've got to see, it's not how beautiful your forehand was. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is, what did that forehand make your opponent do? And the joy of the back and forth of that exhilarating point when you're both playing really well and trying to solve the puzzle. So you can't solve the puzzle if you're consumed with having to be the first one to solve the puzzle, to win the puzzle. It's about solving the puzzle, not about who solves it first. And that's a very tricky re-architecturing of the mindset to do. But if you can lose yourself like that, like a doctor, like a surgeon, okay? Surgeon in the operating room, she sees the blood, but she doesn't emotionally react to it. She's moving for the next instrument she has to have to take the next step. So, okay, you see something happening, but you're not emotionally reacting to it. You're moving to your next step. And that's for between points, that's for in the flow of a point. And it's all impossible if you're focused on yourself and winning and losing.
That's great, Peter. That's great. And where were you when I was 15?
I wasn't playing tennis. I was playing judo.
You were doing judo, yes. You're playing judo.
I was getting thrown onto mats and getting knocked out and having to have smelling salts to get me reawakened and go back in the match.
And this is how you learned this. Okay, so one of the things that
judo,
yeah, it makes me think is you know, when you talk to even pros, they'll say, you know, when they've maybe been struggling or lacking motivation, I need to have fun again. I need to be having fun on the court. Usually when people are struggling, it comes back to fun and fundamentals, right? Yeah. Where it all started, having fun and learning the game. And this is really
Osaka said that after her Australian Open, that for 6 months after that, she wasn't having fun.
No.
And she had to get back to that. So, and not to be Pollyannish about it. I mean, this is not easy, and we're still trying to win. We're competing to win. We want to win. It's okay to have those feelings, right? But if we have a purpose that is more connected to the love of the game, to solving the puzzle, the enjoyment of it, and to taking it less personally. That's where the losing of the self comes in. Looking at it more clinically, like that surgeon. We've got good research that's come out of USC and other places showing that the athletes who have more of that kind of purpose-driven than outcome-driven orientation to things don't have any less failure or disappointment, but they deal with it better. They recover more quickly, right? I mean, that's the big difference in the pros and the rest of us. Their recovery. They make mistakes at a faster speed. They recover from them at a faster speed, but they're the same mistakes we all make. We just recover way more slowly and we make more of them.
So what we're talking about is the ability to adapt quickly, right?
Yes.
So the ability to adapt in those situations has come from that love of the game. Would you say that's because of just that innate need to want to be as good as they can be at all stages? So even when they lose, or even when, it always comes back to that love of the game of going, how am I constantly going to get better? So if we start talking about the teaching part, how do we help our athletes learn that? What are some of the strategies you've put in place to help your athletes learn that component?
Well, I think for starters, we like our athletes, coaches have to make a choice about how much emphasis they're going to give to the mental and emotional game. When I do coaches workshops, first thing I ask is, what percentage of tennis is mental? And usually you'll get, 50% to 90%, all of it. Okay. And you know where this is going. Then the next question is, well, what percentage of your practice time do you spend on the mental? And there's like awkward silence. Right. And so what I say is, look, if you have a 2-hour practice, right, and you're spending 12 minutes intentionally, explicitly, in a systematic way on mental and emotional strengthening, that's just 10%. You are way ahead of your peers as a coach. So you can't expect your players to magically get it when you just say, love the game. You have to love the game more, any more than you can expect them to get it if you just say, toss higher, but you don't show them how. So you have to show them what that actually means. And part of doing that is putting them, I think, in intentional stresses in the practice. And of course, I mean, you don't do this on day one with a new student or a new team. You build your relationship, but as you've built the relationship of trust, now you can put in more intentional stresses into practice and show that how you can react and look at this more clinically, objectively. And I do that a lot by, again, guided self-discovery. We freeze a lot. And okay, did you like what just happened in that point? Not particularly. Okay, what could you have done differently? Tell me some things you could have done differently, and let's have a conversation about that. So it's getting them into the process without lecturing them about you have to love the game more. I mean, I put that up on posters. We put all these slogans up on posters, laminated posters, and we talk about them at the beginning of practice. And I ask them to describe what that means in your own words. So we have, again, ownership of it at the beginning of practice. But I don't lecture about it after that. The rest of it is reinforcing the point through guided self-discovery, through helping them come up with routines to deal with adversity and rehearsing those things behaviorally. It's not enough to write out your routine. You have to rehearse it like an actor, like a musician. So it's a combination, I think, of doing that, of modeling as a coach. You have match locations get changed, match times get changed. Sometimes even your opponent changes from whom you thought you were going to be playing. How in stride does the coach take that? Does the coach frame that as, hey, this is an opportunity? Because this is an opponent who really likes to serve and volley. So, here's what we're gonna change up our game plan. We thought we were dealing with a baseliner. Now we're dealing with somebody else. So wow, this is great opportunity. What can we do with this? So I think you model it as a coach. And then the last thing is how coaches deal with defeats and losses that their students are experiencing. I love, Billie Jean King's story, when she was distraught over losing. She's told this at many places, but I heard this at the Women's Tennis Coaches Association last fall before the Open. Hopefully we'll have another conference and another Open this year. But she was saying, look, she was so upset when she lost, and she'd come home and her parents would simply say, how did it go? Well, I lost. Well, but how did it go? Did you give your best effort? Yeah, but I lost. Well, but if you gave your best effort, that's good enough. So how we react and what we focus on when they tell us, or we've seen them because we accompanied them to the match, we saw that they lost, praise the effort, praise the attitude, praise the learning and the honoring, praise the effort at competing. The last thing is then talking about, okay, what can we change up? What can we reinforce that really worked well? And what maybe needs to change up a little bit to give you a better chance to compete at even a higher level next time? You can do the whole thing without even mentioning the word win and lose. So, yeah.
I like that, Peter. And you're really giving us a ton of ideas of how to bring this to practice, this framework. And I think that's very useful to our listeners. And really what you're getting into is, how do you set up the environment and the messages, the expectations you have? Compete, learn, honor is very clear, and it's defined. And you put these things up on posters, and I love that. And then you allow tennis to happen, right? And you look for teachable moments, and then you intervene, you communicate. And then I'm assuming at the end of practice, there's some debrief or reflection on how it went.
Well, we do a little bit of that, but it's mostly we like the players to reflect before practice, reflect on a goal for practice and on what you're grateful for today. Not in tennis necessarily, but just 1 to 3 things you're grateful for, thankful for. What you're trying to learn today, what your goal is today in practice. And then afterwards, what did you do that helped you learn? What did you learn today? I mean, it's just like at the end of any individual lesson, you're going to say, what did you learn today? Right? You want to check out with your student whether, you actually taught them something. You said things to them, you demonstrated things to them, but did they learn it? You don't know that unless you ask them, what did you learn today? And I ask them too, not just at the end, but while practice is going on or a lesson is going on, I'll ask them if I'm doing something, is this working? Is this working for you? Is this working for the team? And sometimes I can tell it's not. And sometimes I think it is, but I'm going to ask that anyhow. And then I discover that for some players, or at that moment for this player in an individual lesson, that isn't really working. Well, how can we change it to make it work better for you? So that also models my openness to feedback and humility and adapting and adjusting. It's not about, it has to be right. I have to be right. It has to be my way. And it also gives some autonomy and control and voice and choice to the players. So again, they're part of it. One of the themes that I emphasize constantly to the players is, I am your advisor. You are the boss of your tennis career. I'm not the boss of your career. You are. You make the choices. You make the decisions. I guide you, but you have to make the choices. So tell me what you want from me. Tell me. I have a plan. I have a lesson plan. I have a season plan, but I want to know what your plan is. Tell me what you want. And then together we can find something that is going to really maximally work for you and for our team.
That's brilliant, Peter. I mean, what you've hit on there is a big component of how we set up practices and how the preparation reflection is essentially what you've hit on there. And the reflection is, reflecting on that practice, but it's also a tee up to the next practice. And then you go through this cycle of preparation reflection. I guess my question would be, in terms of your actual session itself, do you often set up drills or practices where you know that certain exercises might draw out higher emotions, or and in which case, how do you go about doing that? And when you do go through that, do you tee it up as to say, right, I mean, this is going to be a very tough drill, this is going to be challenge your emotions, or do you just see how it plays out, and then when something does happen, do you use that as a teachable moment? How do you go about the actual practice itself?
It depends, Johnny. Great question. It depends on the students and the student athletes that I'm working with. Just like you can use some joking around and sarcasm a little better with some players than others. I mean, you've got to know your players. And with some players, it takes more of a tee up with, look, this is going to intentionally probably make some of you uncomfortable, because I want you to get out of your comfort zone, because if you're just stuck in your comfort zone, you're not going to grow, right? And with other players, you can just do, okay, here's what we're going to do for the next 8 minutes, 10 minutes. And not a whole lot of teeing it up, other than to say, I always give a reason. There's always a reason for a drill. We're doing this because, I don't do anything without explaining what the rationale is. But more or less of that, depending on the character of the person I'm working with, or the nature of the team that I have, how much they can handle. I do want to make it as real as possible to mimic the stresses of match play. And so one of the things that in a team environment that works really well is every scoring variation, every rule variation that we do that puts stress on them, that counts. The match counts. They're horrified when they find that out the first time in the season. When I say, you only get one serve, or the returner gets 2 returns, or once during a set, you can cheat on purpose. You can call a clearly good ball out one time. And, you're going to have to deal with that, right? And so we'll see what happens. But the score, the match counts, and we record it. It all counts.
That's Larry. Is that the game you're playing in your head when we play often? You're allowed to take a point.
that is made up, by the way, because we don't play, because you won't challenge me. But I think, this idea of creating adversity is very, very important. I love the question, the answer to, how much do you let them know? And I think it depends on the person. I also think it depends on where they're at in the learning process, yes. Right? Because if they're new to this, or this is something they haven't really experienced much, they're going to need more information. But if they have quite a bit of skill and they've been exposed to different scenarios and different stressors you put on them, you can probably put more stress on them without really giving them much information to lead into it. So I think it kind of depends too on how much they've learned and where they're at in that learning process.
Exactly, and that's really an important point. And I think all of them do appreciate that you've got to do something in practice to make it more like a real match, quote unquote, real match. And so that's part of, the whole philosophy. Make practice harder than the matches if you can. I mean, it's an old cliche, but are there ways that you can do that while still respecting and protecting the emotional safety of your players? I mean, we're not trying to be cruel out there. We're trying to build up mental, skills and options, and the ability to have a range of choices that you can make in the response you make to adversity. Okay, so yeah, I think they get that, and it's some players are more analytical, some are more feeling, Some get it more quickly. They don't want a long explanation. Some want, they would have you explain it the whole practice if they could. So, it's finding that balance, especially if you've got a team situation, but even in an individual lesson. I mean, finding that balance, and at that moment, is they may be an experienced player, but what you're working on at that moment is pretty new to them, right? I mean, if they're a big baseline banger and they haven't worked a whole lot on the backhand slice as an approach, and the footwork that goes with that, they're new in that learning curve, even though they're a tournament player from the baseline. So, there's lots of variations and degrees to which the coach has got to adjust. There isn't one way of doing this.
Right.
Yeah.
And if a coach says he's not a mental coach, then he's not taking responsibility, because for what you just said,
right,
even if you're a tennis coach, you're also a mental coach, because of the different situations you have to put players in to prepare them for matches.
Exactly.
The psychology of that, the effect on the brain, and the effect on the performance. There's no way around it. There's no divide there. It's stuff that we need to train the players on. We're not totally preparing them for what they're going into.
Yeah, and it's a perfect opportunity too to reinforce that pretty much everything we're doing with our players on the court is transferable to their off-court life. In the same way that a lot of what goes on off court, players are bringing that, good, bad, and ugly to the practice court and to their matches. So it's not like we have this big wall between the court and the off court. We live our lives, and all of these things kind of bleed into each other. So a lot of what I'm trying to do, what I think coaches who are interested in emphasizing the mental and emotional area are trying to do, is also teach them, not just the cliche of, life lessons, but specifics about, how you prepare, how you sleep, how you eat, what you read, how you study on your own, your degree of initiative, how you resolve conflicts off the court, how you make friendships, and all of this, translates to what you're doing on the court too, and to how good of a learner and how emotionally stable you're going to be through, as Johnny pointed out earlier, the ups and downs of a match and the ups and downs of a practice too. It doesn't stay at the same state. You're constantly adjusting. So it's a real helpful thing to tie the on-court and off-court together.
I'm really pleased you brought that up in terms of, yes, okay, the old cliche, make practices harder than the matches. But it's great that you brought that up from a mental emotional standpoint, because I think when when people say that, I think a lot of the time it's perceived as only physical. So we've just got to drum them and drum them and drum them. And this is going to be physical. It's going to be tough. But what we don't look at is going, okay, well, player has a tough part dealing with solving problems, and because they can't solve problems better, that's what elicits maybe some more emotional reactions. So let's put them in environment. Doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's physical, we're going to drum them into the ground, but it might be a lot more mentally taxing in the drills that you set up are going to require them to have to think more, solve more problems. It's going to then elicit more emotion, as opposed to just trying to drive emotion out of them when they've got nothing left in the tank, which everyone is going to show more emotion when their meter is on empty. But that is not the strategy that we should be taking. It's understanding what that whole cliche, what that term means, and it's not just physical. So I'm really happy you just brought that up and talked about that, because I think that's a really misguided conception when we say that phrase. And so that was great points.
Yeah, that's a great point, Johnny. And I think you touched on something else there when you said the word think, because a lot of the part of this that gets back to how we compete and building on the honoring and the learning is I want them to be thinking in practice, right? Just like when we do progressions, we're going to eventually work the entire smooth motion in a unified motion of whatever stroke or whatever movement we're talking about. But we're doing progressions that focus on pieces of it and getting those pieces right and real conscious, intentional tearing things apart to the smallest units and of units that we can control and building those skills. It's the same with the mental and the emotional. So in practice, we're really looking at what were you thinking that when that point was over, what was going through your mind? Say it. Don't censor yourself. Just say it, record it, whatever it is, building that awareness, because we're trying to get to the point. And one of my chapters is titled, Think During Practice, Feel During the Match. During the match, we want them to feel. And the way I do it, you guys talked in an earlier podcast about the chimp driving the bus when the primitive brain takes over, right? The emotions take over like that. Well, for me, I use the lizard brain, okay? The lizard brain back here is taking over the bus. And the lizard brain knows even less about driving the bus than the chimp does. So we're in a bad way if either the chimp or the lizard are driving the bus. So I want them to be, thinking and really conscious during practice so that they feel they're building new automatic responses that replace the lizard brain and the chimp brain, but they're still automatic and feel on match day. That's what we're trying to go toward. That's the progress we're trying to make.
I was going to make some comment about Johnny here, but I'm going to save it at this point.
You're going to try and call me. You were trying to figure out a clever thing to call me a chimp and a lizard in the same sentence.
Chimp lizard. It sounds like something to be on the Sci-Fi Channel. Chimp lizard.
Chimp lizard.
So, no, I mean, and I think Daniel Goleman has talked about this at length too, in the emotional mind versus the rational mind, and certainly tennis is played in an emotional arena, and so you're going to have to learn to manage those emotions and get to more rational thoughts, or at least train yourself on certain ways of thinking. Even though you are emotional, you can get to those cues and those ideas. I love how you mentioned the difference between thinking in practice and feeling in matches, because it's something I talk to players about. There's different things at work because you have different goals in practice and in matches. And in practices, your goal is to train and to work on things and to give yourself feedback. And so you have this practice mind that's analyzing and it's working hard, right? You're thinking and you're getting feedback and you're communicating with the coach. And so there's a deeper analysis, but when you're performing, it shouldn't be that much analytical work. Now it's more based on training and based on what you see, like you were talking about earlier, what you observe in the match and what's happening with your opponent, and playing this chess game, right? And figuring out the puzzle, as you put it, to get to the end result. But the 99% of the mental effort is just staying present and being with the process of figuring it out, and just being there. And so I love that the idea of, I think we have to help players and coaches understand, and parents, that you don't use the exact same kind of thinking and work that you do in practice as you would in practice matches, potentially, and for sure in matches.
Yeah, exactly. And there are, as you know, and 70-80% of the time in the match is not playing a point. So there's plenty of time in the match, and that's what your routines and rituals are for. You better have a 3-hour or 4-hour in between points routine. You can't be making this up as you go in between points. That needs to be routinized. But then when you're playing the point itself, you want to be more of a jazz musician than a classical musician, is the way I put it to my players. When you're actually flowing, you are improvising. You're trusting that you know the structure, and you're riffing around the structure of how the strokes are produced and the way you want to construct points based on your strengths and areas that you want to hide a little bit. So yeah, you know all that, but now you're confident enough to riff. Then in between points, you can be thinking again, but you don't want to be classical and having to play every note exactly the way it's written when you're in the flow of the match and actually playing a point. So it is a combination of those things in the match. It's not totally feel. In between points, you got to be thinking, but in the routinized way that you've rehearsed.
In much simpler ways, where you're not going into this deeper analysis that takes a lot of cognitive work and is harder to get your focus back to just being present on the environment, the ball, your opponent, what you're trying to do. So, no, this has been tremendous, and it's got me a lot of great ideas, Peter, a lot of things kind of swirling around in my head. You and I share a pretty similar philosophy, so it's always fun to kick around ideas, because I always get better when I talk to you. And definitely the book, I have it here. It's on my desk, The Mental and Emotional Training for Tennis, Compete, Learn, Honor. I think for coaches, this would really help them create a framework. It's a practical framework. It's simple, and yet it's very, very deep and meaningful. And that's how I would put it. There's a lot of thought that's put into this. It's a very strong philosophy, and I just give you a lot of credit for how you've taken a lot of complex ideas and boiled it down to the simple, and yet it maintains its meaning and is very impactful. So it's a really good job.
Oh, well, thanks, Larry. I mean, I've stolen a bunch of your ideas for the book too. So thank you.
That's what we do, right? And someone will steal from you. Mainly it'll be me. I'll steal from you. I'll give you credit though. So
I'll be very pleased if I see you, demonstrating an excuse box. That'd be very cool.
Trust me, there's going to be one at Johnny's desk next time we do this podcast.
That works for me.
Oh man. Okay. So this has been absolutely fantastic. I appreciate your time so much, Peter, and just I want to hit on that point that Larry said there again, because I think a lot of coaches, when they start to look at providing mental skills to their tennis players, they're going, well, I'm not a mental skills. I'm not certified in psychology, or I don't have a degree in psychology. I'm not certified as a mental skills coach. So where do I go? And that hit the nail on the head there, Larry, is we can turn to books to help us create a framework of how we can structure mental skills, integrate it into our practices so that we are creating it on off court. There is this synergy between the two, and it's all connected, as Peter has mentioned. And so this book is a great reference point for people to start and put a mental skills program together. So just wanted to emphasize that. And it's great. Again, I mean, Larry, when you first sort of sent us some information about the book and Dr. Peter Scales, and looking through it, I'm going, well, yeah, these philosophies are very similar. There's Compete, Learn, Honor, and qualities of Compete Like a Champion, very, similar philosophies. So it's always great to hear different perspectives around similar philosophies. And so, again, just really appreciate your time here, Peter.
Oh, well, it's been great talking with both of you, and anytime.
Awesome.
Great to see you, Peter. Be safe, man.
Yeah, you too. Stay safe and healthy.
All right, well, that wraps us up for this week's episode of Compete Like a Champion. We were very fortunate and grateful to get on Dr. Peter Scales. If you have not read his book, we would strongly recommend purchasing it. It is, again, called Mental and Emotional Training for Tennis, Compete, Learn, Honor. So be sure to check that out. We put a link in the show notes that will take you to a synopsis of the book and then where you can go and purchase that. So thank you for tuning in for this week's episode. And Dr. Larry and I, we look forward to speaking with you next week.